Gettysburg, which is acre for acre, known as the most haunted small town in America.
51,000 casualties in those 3 days.
Young men never wanted to fight nor die here, let alone remain here for eternity.
Both sides knew what was on the line. Basically, what you have is the perfect storm for creating ghosts. And that's what Gettysburg was for those 3 days and since.
The Creepy Side of America's Haunted Gettysburg miniseries. Part 3.
Welcome to the Creepy Side of America. I am Dan Kozlowski.
And I'm Carrie Kearns.
Before we get into our last and final Part 3 of this Gettysburg miniseries, I'd just like to remind all of our listeners, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, or follow the Creepy Side of America on whichever podcast platform that you're listening to us on.
And be sure to follow the Creepy Side of America on Facebook for all the latest show information.
So this is our last episode, Carrie, number 3 of our miniseries.
This one really gave me the chills.
This was a good guess. You know, I'm going to give you the honors here. Introduce our last guest to the podcast series.
Yes, Dan, we have Mark Nesbitt. He's an author and owner of Ghosts of Gettysburg Tours. Mark, you've been telling ghost stories about Gettysburg for a long time.
Well, that is correct as far as the ghost stories about Gettysburg is concerned. And I lived in Gettysburg for about 35 years and wrote 8 books called Ghosts of Gettysburg about all the different scary stories and the history of the ghost stories in Gettysburg. So, yeah, I guess I'm the guy to talk to.
Have you always been like a Gettysburg, a history buff? I mean, it says you're a historian as well, so you kind of go way back and talk about all the battles of Gettysburg.
Well, yeah, I used to be a park ranger there. And so I was a park ranger for 6 years and gave a lot of talks out on the battlefield. You know, when you go out there and you see the park rangers giving talks, that was me for about 5 or 6 years. And then I became a licensed battlefield guide there as well. So I took people around the battlefield. Yeah, and Gettysburg, of course, is renowned for being the largest, the bloodiest battle on the North American continent. It lasted 3 days in July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. And when it was all said and done, I mean, the figures vary a little bit, but when it was all said and done, 51,000 casualties in those 3 days. Now, casualties are killed, wounded, and missing, but roughly between 6,000 and 8,000 men were left dead on the battlefield. And a number of the wounded died within a week or two after the battle. So, not to mention the fact that the emotions were running at a high pitch too, because both sides knew what was on the line. You know, independence for the Confederacy and Union for the North. So, basically, what you have is the perfect storm for creating ghosts. And that's what Gettysburg was for those 3 days and since, because, you know, in order to have a ghost, you basically have to have a witness. You know, the ghost stories, you know, just aren't recorded if there isn't some living person to see those. And Gettysburg, for years, used to get between 1 million and 1.5 million visitors a year. That's dropped off a little bit in recent years, but that's a lot of people to be there to witness any kind of paranormal activity that occurs.
Sure.
On the battlefield and also in the town. I mean, the town was part of the battlefield as well. So you have the National Park, which has a lot of stories associated with it. And you have the town of Gettysburg and, of course, the college as well.
Do you remember your first ghost story that you heard while working at Gettysburg?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, Carrie. Yeah, I remember when we'd have a little spare time in the coffee room or something, somebody would always say, well, have you heard any ghost stories about Gettysburg? And I think the very first one I heard that even predates the battle was about Devil's Den, famous landmark there at Gettysburg. It was about a couple of hunters that were out there, and this was probably in the early 1800s before the battle. They were kind of wandering around out there and got lost without any roads. It's just a jumble of boulders, easy to get lost out there in the middle of nowhere, 2 miles south of town. And they were absolutely, it was getting cold and getting dark, and they were absolutely scared to death. They thought they were going to, die out there. All of a sudden, they look up and they see this figure, and he identified the figure as a Native American, and he kind of motioned to him to follow him. What did they have to lose? So they started following this guy, and he led them to a place that they recognized could get out of Devil's Den. And they went to, catch up with him and thank him, and he had disappeared. But this also leads back to another interesting story in that some histories, unwritten histories, oral histories, they talk about a battle that may have been even larger than the Battle of Gettysburg that took place on those very grounds, on Gettysburg's soil, or what was to be Gettysburg soil, between Native Americans, pre-Columbian. No one knows how long ago, 2,000-3,000 years ago. That's another piece of the history, and sort of an eerie question comes up. Was Gettysburg, is the land there cursed?
It seems like there's a lot of tragedy that happens there.
Yeah, I mean, you have not only the white man killing his brothers there, but you also had, the Native Americans also killing brothers on that same ground.
So you're saying that was the first story you believe you heard about the Gettysburg area. Did you hear most of the stories for the tours? Did you collect those as you were working in the tour guide?
That was the genesis of the books, of the whole series. And it was stories that I'd heard from older park rangers. Periodically, a tourist would come in and talk about, do you guys have ghosts here at Gettysburg? We finally got so many questions about that we asked our bosses, what should we say? And the bosses were like, tell them there aren't any ghosts here.
Yeah, I'm sure they kind of want to steer clear of that.
They still have that attitude. They don't want ghost stories being told. Well, like one of my bosses, when I first asked him, have you heard any ghost stories? He said, yeah, he said, but you know what? The real stories here are enough to scare the pants off you. And that's true because of what the men did there and the horror that they went through, which, it's not fiction at all. It's history. But the ghost stories to me are a part of it as well, because it seems like the national park and the historians, once the soldiers are dead and buried, that's kind of it. That's the end of their story. Whereas if you go into the supernatural and you go into the paranormal, you start to realize that maybe these guys have more stories to tell about what happened to them. So at any rate, that's one of the reasons why I'm attracted to the ghost stories. But yes, I did start to hear those originally from older park rangers and tourists that would come in with wild tales that happened to them. So that's the start of it.
Yeah, because I'm sure even like when you said the tourists themselves, I'm sure some of them probably had some pretty wild stories to share.
They were mostly kind of confused. They come in and they say, is there a reenactment going on? Yeah,
because they're not expecting to see a ghost.
No, they are now. I mean, a lot of people come to Gettysburg too, to try and witness or take a picture of a ghost or record one or something. But the stories that I collected came after that initial collecting of stories. A lot of the stories then came once the book started coming out from letters and phone calls and faxes from tourists. That the letters would start off, I've never had a paranormal experience in my life, but we visited Gettysburg this past summer and this is what happened to us. So I have, I don't know how many file folders filled with stories that came strictly from tourists who really weren't expecting anything, who are not prone to having any kind of experiences like that. And yet they had one at Gettysburg, and they wrote to me and told me the details of those. In fact, I have so many, I just this last year or so, I have what I call the lost files. I found a pack of letters from people that I never even used, forgot that I had. So a lot of those are going into the next book, which is Ghosts of Gettysburg 9. So it's the letters continue to come in, and so I get stories that way as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's no shortage in that area, that's for sure.
Nope.
And you worked there as a park ranger and also as a guide for how many years?
It's 6 years. 6 years as a park ranger and a year as a guide.
And did you ever, bump into a ghost?
Well, when I was a park ranger, I lived in 4 of the houses out on the park. Those beautiful houses that are historic.
Mm-hmm.
And every one of them, I had some kind of weird experience. Of course, when in the wintertime, when I wasn't talking to people, when no one comes to Gettysburg, I was on patrol to guard the park, and had an opportunity to spend late nights out on the park, and then of course lived out there. One of the places I lived in was the National Cemetery Lodge. Right inside the National Cemetery where all the soldiers who died at Gettysburg were buried. That was the house that I really had some of the strangest things happen to me in. I remember one afternoon, I was downstairs watching TV, and there was only one other housemate there. He was upstairs. I thought he was reading his book. I heard footsteps. The stairs were behind me. I heard footsteps come down the stairs and stop on the landing. And I was so convinced that I heard those, and I'm like, what does Bill want? I mean, is he watching TV with me or what? And I turned around, there was no one there. But I was so convinced that I heard these steps that I literally got up, walked up the stairs, knocked on his door, and he said, "Come in." I opened the door, and he's lying on his bed about half asleep. He says, What? I said, "What did you want?" He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Didn't you just come down the stairs?" He said, "No, I've been reading. I'm half asleep here." So I heard those. And then the other thing that happened to me in that house was one day I was in there alone, and I just finished lunch, and I picked up my dishes. I'm walking out to the kitchen, and I heard the strangest squealing cry. And I'm like, what in the heck was that? And I'm like, was that the pipes or doors or what? And I was familiar with the house, and I said, I'd never heard that before. And all of a sudden it hit me. That sounded like a child or a baby crying.
Oh, jeez.
And yeah, and there's just no baby in the house. I mean, thought about it and then forgot about it. I guess in the coffee room one day I mentioned it, and someone stopped me. He said, "You need to talk to Mrs. Such and Such, who lived there just before you." So I got in touch with her. I asked her. She says, "Oh, I heard that a lot." She said, in fact, one time I heard the baby cry so loud that I started upstairs, forgetting that my children are all off in school. And it was a while later when I realized, it kind of, dawned on me that just down the street, down the hill from the cemetery lodge, 2 doors down, was the old orphanage that was set up for Civil War soldiers, orphaned children. And that, all of a sudden, it kind of fell together. And I'm like, oh my God, is that what I heard? A little kid or a child crying. Because the first matron for the orphanage was very nice. The second one was very, very cruel. And she used to punish the kids by making them stand outside in their bare feet in the wintertime and things like that. So, that if there's a connection, I always like to imagine that there is some kind of historical connection to these ghost stories. Otherwise, why would they be ghosts?
Yeah.
Why would they be there if they weren't there originally? If there is one for that story, my experience, that would be it. That orphanage down the street.
And it's always better when you could find a little bit of that historical story behind your experiences.
Well, I like to write about the history of each site that had the venue of the experience that people had there. And that's how I collect my stories. I collect, 4 or 5 stories of one site on the battlefield. I do the history about the site, and people can draw their conclusions to that connection that is made between the ghosts and the families or soldiers who lived and died on that particular part of the battlefield. But they're recurring as well. It's not, you're going to read about Devil's Den in just about every single one of my books, or Little Round Top, or the Field of Pickens Charge, or the town of Gettysburg and the college, because things keep happening. One of my chapters in Ghosts of Gettysburg 8 is called Deja Vu, because I realized that stories that I collected 15, 20 years ago, the events are still happening in the same venues, in the same sites that they did. The same stories, the same events are happening that happened 20 years ago to a whole different set of people. And that to me is kind of like almost not quite scientific proof, but kind of like proof that something's going on. If there's a group that sees the same or hears the same thing that happened 20 years ago, something's going on there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a lot of those people that are witnessing what you're explaining as your stories, they don't know the history. So they're seeing it and it's matching up with the history without them knowing it at all. So it's pretty sure that they're not making it up.
That is correct, because most of them are tourists. A lot of them are college students, and some of them, not all of them go to Gettysburg College knowing the history of Gettysburg. Most of them are, they're just going to college, biology majors and stuff like that. So yeah, when they start coming up with these stories of things that happened to them in Devil's Den, and I say, whoa, I wrote about something like that, very similar to that, 20 years ago. That's when that kind of gets me more interested in that. And that's one of the things that I'm going to try and do with this Ghosts of Gettysburg 9. I may have a chapter, Deja Vu 2. So.
And you have a couple tours that you run in Gettysburg.
Yes.
So what would you want to tell people about some of these tours?
Well, first of all, they're called the Ghosts of Gettysburg. There are a lot of different tours anymore. We were the first. This is our 30th year, so we've had a lot of practice giving these tours. And this year we're offering 3 different tours for people. The Baltimore Street Tour, which is kind of like in town. The college campus Carlisle Street Tour, which is the north section of town. And the Chambersburg Street Tour, which is the west side of town. They all last about an hour and 15 minutes. The best thing for them to do if they want to book one is to go onto our website, which is ghostsofgettysburg.com, if they're interested in that.
So out of the 3 tours that you just mentioned, if you had to pick one of your favorite stops on the tours, what would be one of your favorite stopping grounds?
Oh, that's a good question. But there's so many good stories out there. But I think, and I don't want to give too much away, but
sure,
one of my stops that I really like that everybody seems to be fascinated with. It's on the Carlisle Street College campus tour, because there's a story. This has been on television a number of times, because they pick up on this. It's about, all I can say is it's the elevator story of Pennsylvania Hall, which is called Old Dorm. The largest building on the north end of town at the time of the battle was one of 3 buildings at Pennsylvania, now Gettysburg College. It's still standing there. It's beautiful, columned edifice, and it was used as a hospital during the battle. In the 1980s, several people had an experience when they got on the elevator there. I don't know if I should go any more than that. If maybe that's not enough of a teaser.
Well, that's up to you. I don't want to have you give too much away.
Well, plenty of other stories on that tour, so I might as well finish that one.
Sure.
Actually, 2 friends of mine were administrators. It's an administration building now, as it was back then in the 80s. And they were working late one night, and it was about 11 o'clock. Finally, they said, okay, let's get out of here. And remember, once again, the historical part about this is that Pennsylvania Hall was used as a hospital The lower floors were used as the operating rooms. Upper floors were used as recovery rooms. So these two women got on the elevator and punched the buttons and started heading down to the first floor where the exits were. Well, the elevator skipped the first floor and headed down towards the basement. They were upset because, come on, we want to get out of here. The elevator's malfunctioning again. The doors opened into the basement into a scene outside the elevator, outside of time and outside of any kind of reason. It was a hospital scene that they looked out into, and they saw bodies of men all around the edges of the scene. There was a makeshift operating table. There was a guy in a stained smock, and he was getting ready. He had a saw in his hand. He was getting ready to cut off somebody's leg. They're pressing the button, trying to get out, okay, and nothing's working. The elevator will not function. Finally, the elevator doors closed, and they went up to the first floor, exited, got over to the security office, and I interviewed the security guard, and he confirmed the identities of these two women for me, and he said they were scared to death. He said, I thought, let's go back because maybe this is a fraternity playing a prank, and I'm going to catch them red-handed. Yeah. So they got over there, got on the elevator. Those are pretty two gutsy women, I'd say. Got on the elevator, went down, the doors opened. The scene was pristine. It was all whitewashed. It was the basement that they were used to. There was absolutely no trace of anything they'd seen before. Interestingly enough, I was doing an autographing at Gettysburg College, and a couple came in and they said, we know that woman that happened to. I said, oh, you know such and such, no. Oh, you must know. And I mentioned the two women, and it wasn't them. They gave me the name of another woman who the circumstances were similar. She was working on the top floor, but they were doing an auditing of Gettysburg College, an accounting firm. They said, will you go downstairs, go out to the cars and get some paperwork? So she got on the elevator, down it went. Same scenario, went into the basement, and she saw this exact same thing. I called her up and interviewed her over the phone. She described exactly the same scene that these two women saw. So that's three people who had that experience, kind of like a portal opened.
Yeah, almost they're going back to a different time.
Absolutely. And now the scary part is that it was an elevator, the doors open, and there's no place to go.
Yeah.
You're not getting out of there.
Yep, your back's up against the wall, literally.
Yeah, that's like something you see in a horror movie.
Absolutely. So that building's on the college campus tour. That building is still there. It's beautiful. It's a lovely building. So that's just a little teaser. But there are a lot of stories that are very similar to that. Maybe not quite as dramatic or as photogenic as it looked on TV, but it's definitely a part of that Carlisle Street tour.
It definitely sounds like a very interesting tour, just listening to that one story.
Yeah, well, most of the tours have between 8 and 10 stories, and like I said, they're about an hour and 15 minutes, and we had the best guides. They tell the stories even better than I do because they do it so many times. They do 50, 60 tours a year, so I would recommend that one. Also, we have an app. No one's allowed to go out on the battlefield and use it for commercial enterprise, but I did record an app of the ghosts of the Gettysburg battlefield, and they can find that and download it on their phone. Find that also on our website, ghostsofgettysburg.com. They can take that if they want to take a ghost tour out on the battlefield itself.
Oh, so they can kind of do that in their own pace then.
Yeah, they can do it. Or they can do it at home because there are pictures with the app. They can watch it. So it's kind of fun. It just came out 3 or 4 years ago.
Anyone planning on taking a trip to Gettysburg to see one of your tours or maybe just see the sights, do you have any tips for them?
My biggest tip would be to, plan a little ahead. Look at some of the other things to do in Gettysburg. Definitely get a historic tour. And there are half a dozen different ways To do that in Gettysburg, you can take a licensed battlefield guide, which is probably, in my opinion, the best, having been one. It's a personalized 2-hour tour of the battlegrounds. They can take a bus tour, which is also good, or they can do it on their own. They have maps like in every national park to take a tour around the grounds. But then give us a call or look on our website. I think that's going to add a little. History is tough to learn. You got figures, you got people, and especially the history of a battle, because there's so many people involved, so many numbers to know, and it's hard to remember. But if you hear a really good ghost story associated with one particular section of the battle or one particular individual in the battle who ended up being a ghost, it's a lot easier to remember. I mean, I guess that's the role of folklore in a way, and that actually is, I think that's one of the advantages of taking a ghost tour is people don't forget ghost stories.
Yep. The entertainment.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And before we leave you, Mark, one more time, if anyone was interested in taking one of your tours, what's your website again?
Ghostsofgettysburg.com. Now, it's ghosts, it's plural, because there's apparently another website out there, just Ghost of Gettysburg. This is ghostsofgettysburg.com. And they can buy my books, they can book a tour, they can buy that app. That'll get them prepared for their trip to Gettysburg.
And are your tours only on the weekends, or is it during the week as well?
Information would be on the website, but come the beginning of May, it starts to get really busy, even during the week. And then of course, once we get into June, July, and August, it's almost every day. So but that information is on the website.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mark.
Well, thank you, Dan and Carrie. It's nice talking to you.
It was wonderful talking to you and hearing your stories.
Well, thanks again.
Yep, thank you. Thanks for listening to our 3-part miniseries on haunted Gettysburg.
Do you have a spooky story or an idea for an upcoming episode? Email us at ghost@wnep.com.
Stay tuned for more episodes exploring the creepy side of America.
And Dan, we have something spooky up our sleeves for next time. Stay tuned.
Ooh, I guess we gotta get back to the drawing board.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Creepy Side of America. If you have any ideas or topic suggestions for an upcoming episode, send them to ghost@wnep.com. We're dying to hear from you.